appropriately zen enough. They don't make these things.
It's pretty wise.
I think there's like an industry standard, and it's not for 6'3". The great thing about being a moderator for this is I don't have anything to moderate. They're moderate personalities and temperaments, so there'll be none of that required. I really do think it'll sustain itself, and at some point we'll do questions if that's appropriate. David Girault is trained as a lawyer. He now is a businessman, and Sam Garcia is trained as an architect, which makes him by default a businessman too. But they, unbeknownst to me, have been thinking about the next McAllen, where the air will still be sweet and the water sweeter than any place else in the valley, right?
And much like Lake Wobegon, all the children will be above average.
All right, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. All right. Are we going to do this?
Let's do this.
Let's do this. All right. This is a little bit different than the regular format of a future McAllen meeting or emerging leaders meeting. We thought tonight that the format would be a little bit more informal. We were just going to treat this as kind of a conversation between two nerds who love municipal planning and city planning history and things like that, politics and economics and all of that good stuff. The way this came about, the whole idea of Next McAllen, was a conversation that started at Emerging Leaders at the Chamber of Commerce in the spring. It was a springboard from Pablo and the work that they've done about putting forth and putting forward some new ideas to look at McAllen and our region in a different way. That kind of bled into, over the summer and into October, I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in the TEDx McAllen, and that sort of prompted me to start thinking about this notion of our place in the world and the thematic entry point of borders and breaking borders. And then Dave and I reconnected. We've served on boards for a number of years now, but we've never really gotten into the weeds about something that we're both extremely passionate about. And so that's when you and I started having that chat.
Yeah, so I attended the TEDx event and heard Sam's talk on his concept of breaking borders and which border or borders are really the relevant ones to us and the ones we can do something about. And it rekindled a discussion. Ironically enough, my thought process came out of the Emerging Leaders program too, from a different level. When the concept of the Emerging Leaders first came about, Brian Lewis asked me to kind of be there and be, along with him, one of the cool uncles of these young 20-something folks in McAllen who were wanting to do something and to make their imprint on our community. And so Brian and I started talking about things that we had seen with him growing up for a time here in McAllen, and then he and I as young professionals and now emerging empty nesters as our kids have grown up here. And one of the questions that Brian and I came to and wrestled with were these same borders that Sam talked about. So after Sam's talk, he and I sat down and to use the phrase that Sam used in his talk, we nerded out for an afternoon on municipalities and borders. Mm-hmm. That led to Sam inviting me to join him in doing this presentation for Futuro McAllen. And like Sam said, this isn't your normal Futuro presentation. We didn't feel like this was, I don't think either of us feel we are the authority on the subject such that we could stand behind a podium and lecture anyone here. We want this to be a conversation between Sam and I that you all are joining into, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback as we go through the program.
Right.
So that's kind of how we got here. And speaking of how we got here,
right.
That's kind of the point. I've always felt that if you want to know where you're going, you got to at least figure out where you're at first. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this idea of border and which border or borderers are the ones that we should focus on, how those borders came to be, and then some thoughts that Sam and I have on what to do about them.
And to underline and to kick off the direction without being too vague for too long, when we talk about borders, you know, I think or border crisis or the border issue, the thing that immediately comes to mind is that north-south border, the river and the border between the United States and Mexico. We live on the border, we're a bi-national region, and so when you talk about, you know, at first blush, what is the border issue that affects us, you would think it's that north-south border. But if you take a step back, you realize that that's not really our border. That's a much bigger border, and the powers that be that dictate what happens there are located in Washington and Mexico City. You know, we just happen to be close to it, but they're not necessarily our borders.
Exactly. We periodically make our pilgrimages to the capitals, and our city leaders with hat in hand ask for a few more border agents or a bridge permit or things like that. But by and large, that's a border that has been realized and regulated and assessed and reassessed and controlled and funded, politicized and depoliticized and militarized and demilitarized, all completely outside of our control. It's something that it certainly affects us on a daily basis, but it's not something that we can affect necessarily or in any significant degree. But there's another set of borders here in our region. And rather than the border that runs east and west and divides us north to south, the borders that Sam and I want to talk about are by and large the borders that run north to south and divide us east to west as a region. And those are the municipal boundaries and the school district boundaries. And we want to talk about why we have those and maybe question, well, not maybe.
And question, are they still useful? How useful are they?
How are they still useful? And if they're not useful, what can we do about it?
Right.
So, and let me officially acknowledge my daughter, Maddie, who is going to be doing our slides for us because the clicker doesn't work. So until we can affect the budget in McAllen and get a new clicker for the library, Maddie will be advancing our slides. So if you'll hit the button there.
So what are we looking at here?
What we're looking at here, and this is for those of you who have been around the Valley for any amount of time, some of this may be a little bit old school. You might learn one or two new things about it. But like I said, to know where we're going, we have to understand where we're at and how we got here. So this is a cutout from it's from the 1911 Texas General Land Office map of Hidalgo County. So just a hair over 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these north-south lines that you see are lines that at that point had already been there for about 150 years. Those lines, you may have heard the term porciones talked about. Well, this is what they're talking about. In 1767,
prior to the American Revolution,
when all of Texas and the western United States were part of Spain,
mm-hmm.
The settlers that had come to the Rio Grande region had mostly settled on the Mexican side of the border in towns like Matamoros and Reynosa, although Reynosa was actually upriver from where it is now, had asked the Spanish crown, come in and define what belongs to whom. And so in 1767, there was an event called the Visita General, which emissaries of the Spanish crown came down and essentially laid out our region. And there were some fundamental principles that they looked at in laying out the lands in the region. And interestingly enough, they're what I call the economic development plan of the 18th century. Transportation.
Transportation was basically the river.
The river, exactly.
This was a ranching economic development plan.
Right.
And the most important thing, if you were going to live in this part of the world, and if you were going to have any chance of success, was you had to have river frontage.
Exactly. So the Spanish crown came in and laid out these porciones. They are by and large 1 league wide, which is about somewhere around a half a mile, not quite, 9/13 of a mile wide, and 15 miles long, and give access to the river to each owner. And that was put in place in the mid-1700s, and pretty much that was the way our region was through the period of Mexican independence, through the period of the Republic of Texas, through the annexation of Texas into the United States, the Civil War, and post-Civil War. This was the region. The only town prior to about the 1890s, the only town in Hidalgo County was Hidalgo. Then in about 1895, John Klausner started experimenting with irrigation. And that began the next generation.
That was the sort of the next, that kicked off our second phase. So first, historically, this was a ranching region. It then became a farming region.
Exactly.
Right? So these lines in the ground come from way back, but then that affected the next phase of development, which was the small cities that supported the farming communities.
Right.
We go to the next slide. You'll see this on your left is kind of broken up into 2 pieces. One long porción, which starts basically where Hidalgo is, and that's where McAllen started. It was located within the confines of one north to south porción.
Actually 3. But yeah, the porciones are a little bit half-mile wide. So you see, this is, if you look at McAllen, the left side of the map here is Bicentennial Boulevard. The street or road that you see up the middle of the map, kind of next to where the grid of the town is 10th Street. And the road on the far right of the map is Colonel Road, 2nd Street. And those 2 lines are the east and west borders of Porciones 64, 65, and 66. So
that comprised the original.
That comprised the original development of McAllen, and we didn't bother pulling all of them, but there's basically virtually identical drawings of FAR, of Mission, of San Juan, of Alamo, and with the railroad having come through a little bit before this in 1904, 1905, this is kind of how we got this layout that we got. And again, it continued to serve the needs of the region.
How would you say it served the needs of the region?
The canal systems were basically built on these porciones, 15 miles deep and 3 or 4 miles wide, with a main canal running up one side of it. And the office of the irrigation company was in town, and you had this small group of a few hundred families that bought 40 acres and began farming, and transportation was still in its infancy. There was the railroad, there were a few cars, the road systems weren't there, and so you came to your local town that was tied to where you ordered your water for your irrigation, and the town sprang up with local conveniences like general stores and post offices.
So this is where you saw the influx of people who, I would say many of our own ancestors and people that are in this room today came to this part of the world during this time frame.
Yeah,
when they started selling off land.
Yeah, they started selling off. I mean, if you look at that map, this particular map has the notation of all of the original lot buyers in the Hidalgo Canal Company development. And there are names that we recognize that are now street names and building names all over our community. This is where it started. And again, as an agricultural region, it worked.
Right.
It continued to function with these lines. And as Sam and I were talking about this the other day, you know, Sam said, well, he asked me, well, when do you think it stopped? When do you think it stopped being stopped making sense, or began the process of not necessarily serving us anymore? And, you know, I think maybe in the 60s when the expressway was built was maybe a start of it. But it didn't really begin until about 20 years ago, about the time I came back to McAllen from college and law school, and we really started transitioning from a rural, an agricultural community and economy into a more urbanized region with more emphasis on retail, on tourism, on trade.
Right.
That was the catalyst of the growth of the maquila sector. Really from the late 80s forward is when the maquila sector was developed in Reynosa in earnest, and we had a lot more people moving in that, I mean, I grew up in this environment but down in Los Fresnos, so you know, the town folk started coming to the area, you know.
So if we start looking at it, we can say that originally this part of the world was settled and delineated as a ranching rural place. That transitioned into, it was seemingly a natural transition into a farming rural sort of place. As some of the towns that sprung up to serve that type of economy grew, they began to distinguish themselves, McAllen in particular, through retail, commercial type and manufacturing to some extent.
Right.
These cities began to compete with each other, McAllen being the prime example of the majority of the growth. And that was sort of the trajectory of growth that has served us up until, well, to present day. That's still the method. However, the interesting thing is that those original lines and those original borders that separate the cities that run north-south, separate east-west, they are beginning to blur and they matter less and less. Would you agree with that?
I would, and that's kind of where this conversation with you and I began was, and it's the same conversation that Ryan and I had a year and a half ago, was, you know, the new movie theaters opened over in Farr on Jackson Road, which is right around the corner from my neighborhood, and we go, you know, that's where we go to the movies, if we, before the new H-E-B just opened on 2nd Street, you know, if we needed something significant and we didn't want to run up to Trenton, we'd hop on the expressway and run over to the H-E-B Plus in Sherryland. And I think all of us here do that every day here, and we don't think twice about it.
Right.
I remember having a conversation when with someone in real estate here in the community when the Walmart went in on Trenton and McCall. And I said, why put a Walmart on Trenton and McCall? And they said, well, there's a lot of rooftops, you know, right within a mile or so. And my response then was, yeah, but those rooftops are in McAllen. Are people actually going to go to Edinburgh to shop? But now we don't think twice about it. Right. You know, for the last 3 years that my daughter had her ag projects out at the MISD Ag Farm, and we drive up McCall and across Trenton. If we needed something, we'd swing into the Walmart because it was right there. But what has begun to happen is that those convenience decisions that we're all making are now starting to have some significant consequences in our individual municipalities. They're unintended consequences from our part. We just, you know, I'm going to Walmart because it's convenient. I'm going to the movie theater because it's the one with the Starbucks, so that's where my kids make me go. We're going to the H-E-B Plus because it has what we need. But every time we make one of those decisions, we're also actually allocating sales tax dollars to different pockets.
Right.
And so, you know, the mayor, Mayor Darling has proposed some ideas of, gee, wouldn't it be nice if we could find a way to share tax revenues or ways of cooperation. And
well, there's an idea, one of the things that we begin to talk about now
Yeah.
is regionalism.
Right.
And what does that mean? And when we are an area of multiple cities, but at the same time we are beginning to function as one unified city. That's really the question.
Right, and I think we have to face a little bit of reality with that. I was just today, the UTRGV and the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank and the Chamber had a border economic development symposium. And kicking off the symposium, Steve Elanius from the Chamber commented that the most important word in our region right now and for the foreseeable future is cooperation. And if we don't achieve significant levels of cooperation, then all of the things we see happening with the university merger and things like that are kind of all for naught. But I would kind of challenge that thought process a little bit, and I'm kind of one of those guys that I'm a go big or go home kind of person by nature. And Tracy's probably nodding as I say that. And I guess what I'm starting to question is, rather than forcing cooperation, is it time to just restructure?
Right.
Because there's a reality, there's a human reality to all of this. And we heard it, any of y'all that were here last month for the Transportation Forum, you heard Sam Vail talk about this topic in terms of transportation. And the truth is, we all go to Austin or to Washington, linked arm in arm, brother with brother, to ask for things for our region with a overriding strategy of what we want. But then the powers that be break us up into our little silos again and say, okay, they'll have one-on-one meetings with FAR and with McAllen and with Brownsville. And the reality is, what happens in those one-on-one meetings is the regional agenda doesn't necessarily get flipped on its head, but it kind of gets chiseled away out around the edges. And it's natural. I mean, if I had the city, if I asked the city to come into our neighborhood and help us spruce up and beautify the neighborhood, we would all talk about the great stuff for the neighborhood, but the reality is, I really don't care if anything gets beautified 2 blocks over. I need the stuff on my block fixed up.
And that's a natural outgrowth of the way things are set up and the way that each individual city is tasked with
Right.
responding to its own constituents. That's
Right.
only normal.
Right. Fundamentally, Mayor Darling and the 6 commissioners have to answer to the electorate of McAllen.
Right.
And regionalism is great as long as it's helping McAllen. But when it begins to help FAR or Edinburgh, they have an obligation to tweak that.
Right. Just like in FAR, it makes sense for regionalism to a certain extent. But then you get to the point they split us up into different rooms and then kind of begin to pit us against each other as a negotiating factor.
Right.
Or when a company's going to come down here, or something's going to, say a large manufacturing concern is going to relocate to this part of the world, they then begin to our detriment, play us against each other.
Right. So we began kind of asking the question of, well, what can we do about it?
Right.
And interestingly enough, I discovered as I started asking this question of, okay, well, can we change this? And there's a great example in history that we're all familiar with, but probably nobody knows that it's an example of this,
Right.
and that is New York City.
Of course.
Arguably the greatest city in the universe, at least so far,
That we
from
know.
what we've been able to find.
From a certain point of view.
For a certain point of view, certainly many great things have happened there and have come out of there, and there's a history of New York City that we could look at as a model,
Right.
potentially. And
So do we have some slides?
yeah, we've kind of not had Maddie moving the slides along, so kind of move us ahead. Okay, that's
where we came from.
where we came from, fruit trees.
Well, this is interesting because what am I looking at? Am I looking at McAllen? Am I looking at Mission? Where does one particular thing begin
I don't know, it's your slide, what are we?
Well, that's a slide looking out the window of my office, and it looks over downtown McAllen into Mission through Sherryland. And it always strikes me when I'm up there that I can't really tell where things begin and end. Or when you know, if you've ever flown into the valley at night, where, you know, there is no distinction.
Or even when you fly in during the daytime, I mean, there's not bright colored lines painted down Jackson Road that
Right.
tells you that that's the border between Farr and McAllen.
Absolutely.
There's just a green sign on the highway here
Right.
and there. So
let's move us on one more. Okay.
So this is kind of the patchwork of the valley that has evolved out of.
If you talk especially in the upper valley, it still retains the traces of those porciones.
Yeah. The lines are all still there, and we've now grown together so much that those lines are completely up against one another. In putting the slides together for this, and unfortunately it didn't project well, so we didn't put it in here, but we were able to look on Google Earth, and I'd encourage all to do this. Go on to Google Earth, and one of the things you can do on Google Earth is you can dial the date of the satellite images back in history. Unfortunately, you can only go back about 20 years.
But it's enough to begin
But
to
it's
get
enough
a
to
sense.
begin to get a sense that you could really see in the McAllen, Mission, Edinburgh, Hidalgo, Farr area how just 20 years ago you could really see from the arrow, there was a clear separation, and you could see where each of the towns are. And now you can't. It is complete urbanization from west of Mission to really almost to Ghana.
Yeah. With a slight blip, and then you get to west of it.
And so, you know, what can we do about this? So, I guess going back to the New York example,
Right.
For those of you who do or don't know, we're going to tell you anyway. New York, we all know about the 5 boroughs of New York, right? We're all familiar with Brooklyn and the Bronx and Manhattan and Queens and Staten Island.
Right.
We've heard of those. They're identifiable. You know,
We've seen it in movies.
We've seen the movies.
It's well
They're
known.
identifiable places,
Right.
but they're all in the city of New York. Well, why is that?
Right.
And so I found quite accidentally, again, I don't even remember how I ran across this, but in about 1890, Brooklyn was starting to emerge as a growing city alongside of New York City. New York City was only what we now know as Manhattan and the Bronx,
Right.
essentially. And Brooklyn was beginning to emerge, and that same thing that was happening there, that was happening here now, was happening there. The Brooklyn Bridge had been built, and trade and commerce and business began to spread and blur, and people started wondering the same things that we're wondering.
Yeah, does it make sense that I have to deal with, you know, as an architect, does it make sense that I have to deal with a permitting department in Mission, in Farr, in Edinburgh, in, you know, La Jolla, in every single town, with each one with a different set of rules?
Right.
And a different set of norms.
Yeah,
and procedures.
what is that costing in terms of your time and your effort? And potentially, you know, literally, you could have a client that wants to put some type of business, a retail store, a restaurant, whatever,
Right.
and if they want to open one in Mission and one in McAllen and one in Farr and one in Edinburgh, and it's conceivable that they'd have to build essentially 4 distinct buildings with 4 different sets of plans because of 4 different sets of rules.
Right.
You know, at the same time, click there. The school system we have here
That's an overlay off,
is an overlay of that same set of lines.
but that doesn't necessarily jive with the cities now.
No, it doesn't jive with the cities at all. Mayor Darling will tell you that if the city of McAllen wants to do something that impacts all the kids that live in McAllen, they've got to deal with 7 school districts to do that.
Right.
STC, which is a great example of a regional overlay that works from Hidalgo County to Starr County, has got some phenomenal early college, high school programs and dual degree programs, but they have to do that. They have to create those programs 17 different times in Hidalgo County.
For all the different schools.
With each different school district. Each one of the, by the way, just so you know, because it's not that obvious, each one of the red lines here is the boundaries of a school district. So you've got McAllen, Sharyland, Mission, La Jolla, Hidalgo down here at the bottom, PSJA, Edinburgh up above, Donna, Weslaco, Mercedes, Progresso, Ed Calcelsa, La Villa, and each one of those have, many of them have a significant enrollment, but not a particularly earth-shattering enrollment.
Right.
Let's get back to the New York piece because I want to finish talking through that and
Okay, so here's where we started with that. The basic premise is you had 5 different cities that existed at one point.
Right.
That were each growing, developing, putting in their own infrastructure and doing their own thing. They got to a point, and it got to a point where services were being duplicated, where interests were beginning to align, and where politically speaking, and to encourage business, it made sense for those 5 cities to merge into one city.
Right.
I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Right. Interestingly enough, and I don't know if this is, there's correlation and then there's causation. I think this may just be an interesting correlation, but we talked about our lines here being about 250 years old or so, and ironically, this conversation in New York in the late 1800s was about 250 years after the founding of New York City.
Right.
So it takes time for these problems to develop, but there's a solution to it.
And I think we talked about something last night when we were kind of chopping this up, is the analogy of a plant, the potted plant. There's a time, if you've anybody ever grown a tree, that it starts in a small pot, and as it gets a little bigger, you transfer it, and maybe do that 2 or 3 times, but there comes a point where you have to put it in the ground and let it, for it to achieve its full potential. If not, it gets root bound, it gets hemmed in by an artificial border.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of where we're at, and that's essentially what New York did. So a group of leaders went to the New York legislature in the mid 1890s and basically got the New York legislature to call an election.
Right.
To say yes or no, do we want to consolidate these 5 towns into a single city? At that point, they were a little larger than we are now, but not a whole lot. At that time, the New York City population was about 1.5 million, and Brooklyn was about another 800,000. So they were about 2.5 million total population at the time that they did this election. We're a little less than that. We're at about 800,000 in Hidalgo County metro area.
So we're at about a third.
About a third
of that size.
But running into those same issues. So they had their election in 1894. They voted to consolidate. So that caused me to kind of scratch my head and go, well, gee, can we do that here?
And that's the thing that I think maybe we've been kind of just circling.
Yeah.
But to land the plane, the question is, and this is the question that we've had all along, is could the cities of Edinburgh, McAllen, Mission, Farr, and Hidalgo, those 5 towns,
Right.
Could they merge? Does something legally exist for that to happen?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes or no.
Yeah. Their answer is a definitive maybe.
Yeah.
The local government code, I'm put on my lawyer hat here now. The local government code does in Texas have a mechanism that allows municipalities to merge. However, it is basically the little towns get rolled into the big town.
That's Houston. just kind of.
Right. There's a mechanism to have an election, and if the people in the adjoining towns to whichever the large one is vote in favor, then snap of the fingers, that town is part of the larger town and adopts all of its ordinances, all of its city codes, all of its city charter provisions across the board.
Is there a snowball's chance in hell that that would ever happen in this case?
I don't think so.
Right.
I don't think so. I think that all of the adjoining communities here have grown to a level that if we're talking about this, we have to have what in the corporate world gets termed a merger of equals.
Exactly.
It's not a takeover. It's not an acquisition. And there's not a mechanism for that.
Municipal. But
Municipal.
School districts, there is a mechanism.
There is. And in fact, even in Texas, there's a long history of consolidation in school districts.
How does that work?
It basically can begin with a dialogue between the school districts. There's a mechanism under the education code to basically create a plan of merger similar to a corporate merger that lays out, this is how we're going to put things together, this is how it's going to work, and you present that plan to the electorate. And again, it's up to the electorate, it's an up or down vote of the electorate. But if it passes in both districts, then the plan is executed. So it's not everybody rolls into the big one and has no say-so about how it works.
So if, for example, the Texas Municipal Code were to be slightly modified, if we were to hack that code a little bit and kind of insert some provisions here and there to make it so that municipalities could put forth a merger plan and then put that to their constituency, that would be maybe something that could work.
I think that's viable. I think at least it's something that needs to be brought out of the dark and given some light.
Right.
And that's what we want to kind of have happen with this conversation.
So let's go into one of our next slides.
Yeah.
And you know, if we haven't been dry and nerdy and boring enough, we're actually going to show some numbers.
Yeah.
So
I'm now a professional CFO, so now I have to talk about numbers as if I'm not nerdy enough with the law.
okay, and this is really the bottom line of these next three slides, which basically nationally, Brownsville, which is the biggest city in the valley, ranks 130. McAllen ranks 187. Statewide, Brownsville is the 16th biggest city. McAllen's the 21st biggest city. In both cases, our major cities in the valley are at best AA ball minor league towns.
Right.
At best.
When it comes to cloud at the Capitol, when it comes to, infrastructure, when it comes to economic development, when it comes to recruiting business and industry, we beat the drum of the MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area.
And we're kind of like one, and it's kind of like one city, but it really isn't.
Right, exactly. And we force that argument because it's the only argument we have to say, no, we really are one of the big guys.
But we're not.
But we're not yet, technically. But if we were to look at some combining, before we go to these slides, I've got kind of some nerdy school numbers too. Because I think the school district conversation is a big piece of this. And this actually blew my mind. As much as some of the city numbers are you're going to be wowed by, the school district numbers. Houston ISD and Dallas ISD are the two largest school districts in the state.
Which isn't really a surprise.
Not a surprise. Houston ISD has 122,000 students.
Okay.
Dallas ISD has 158,000 students.
Okay.
If we were to combine just the school districts in this McAllen, Mission, Hidalgo, we by the way, we came up with a name, which sucks, I admit, but it's something to call
It's
it.
FEM.
FEM.
PHEM.
FEM, not phlegm, Davis. FEM, Far, Hidalgo, Edinburgh, Mission, McAllen.
Right.
So
FEM.
So FEM
For now.
Now, we don't know if that would make all of us feminists if we do this plan. But that's another question. But if we were to do this on the school level, it's actually two more pieces. It's a seven-way merger because of Sherryland and Valley.
Okay, all right.
But seven-way merger, just those districts would be 125,000 students.
So it becomes the third biggest school district in the
Second biggest school district.
It overtakes.
It overtakes Houston. Talk
Okay.
about a seat at the education table nationally. A 95% Hispanic, 122,000 student school district.
What does that, I mean, that begins to have effects on how textbooks are written, what curriculum is implemented nationally. It begins to really affect a national dialogue.
We can't be denied a seat at the table.
Right.
If that's the population. And the reality is, it's the population we represent now. There's just no way to do it collectively.
Right.
Effectively, we talk about being that collectively, but it keeps getting chinked away in the corners.
Right.
So let's look at city-wise what this would do. Go ahead and hit the next slide, Maddie. So this is
FEM.
FEM, or greater. I'd done the slide as Greater Hidalgo, and then we decided we thought FEM was more ridiculous, and we went with it.
Right.
So
you just combine
the five
FEM,
cities:
FAR,
Hidalgo, Edinburgh, Mission, McAllen.
Okay. Now, that city is the 48th biggest city in the country. It's the 7th biggest city in the state. We're now approaching a more, you have a bigger level of clout.
Right. If you look at, and hit the back button just a bit. If you look at the cities around us, maybe a few of them we've heard of, maybe they haven't, but you're definitely, you're in the group of the odds are 50-50 if somebody's ever heard of you.
Where the hell is that?
Yeah, exactly. Which is where we are. I mean, how many times when we travel, you say I'm from McAllen, and
I mean,
when I was in
college, there's a whole like, okay, I'm from the valley, or when I talk to people, it's like, have you ever seen the map of Texas? It's as far south as you can go, or have you ever heard of South Padre? We've all had to make that kind of awkward explanation.
Yeah, in my consulting firm I'm with, I'm in the Houston region.
Okay.
Because they think we're all in South Texas. Right. So go back. So just combining here locally,
right,
in these cities that are all running together anyway, moves us up to where, to use the modern vernacular, we're kind of a play-in.
Right. A little bit.
A little bit.
I mean, now we're in the same grouping as Cleveland, Oakland, state capitals, regional kind of important places. I mean, it certainly, it doesn't move us up into that number one tier, that first tier, which, okay, you can't do that overnight necessarily, but it does, just by changing some lines and acknowledging that we are a city and that we do begin to operate that way, and we already do operate that way, we, move to...
Again, to a point where at least we're guaranteed a seat at the table.
Right.
Why didn't you run the numbers for the whole map?
Funny you should ask. did you plant her in the audience and have her? Because Sam, in his TED Talk...
Did all of you hear what she said?
Yeah. Their question was, why didn't you run the numbers for the whole valley? Sam, in his TED Talk, actually came up with a name for that as well.
Right.
Which you may have heard of it. It's called Rio South Texas.
Right. Rio South,
Texas. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Matt. This isn't really the whole valley. I cheated a little bit on this one because I wanted to make a point.
This is the I-2 corridor.
This is the I-2 corridor from Mission to Brownsville, plus Hidalgo and Edinburgh as the outliers. But basically just consolidating what is now the municipal commute from here to Brownsville. The valley. The core of the valley. We move up to the 18th largest city in the country. And the number 6.
If you look at that, just about every one of those cities has at least one, if not more, professional sports franchises, major hubs. They have Fortune 500 companies that are headquartered there. Those are legitimately big league cities.
Yes.
Right.
Right, and we're there. Now, if you did this and then annexed the unincorporated areas that are urbanized in our region, it's almost 1.4 million people. Where does that move us in Texas? Where does that move us in the United States? We're in the top 10 largest cities. Is that a game changer? Is that an idea worth dusting off and talking about and saying, you know, these lines that, you know, but we're from far, we're from Mission.
I grew up in Mission, and I've been in Mission my whole life, and like, grandma's from Mission, and, you know, I'm a Mission Eagle, I'm not Mission Eagle. But, you know, so there's that argument.
There is that argument, but one of the things, and I think this is something that had to happen, is with out of the FIM group now, with the exception of Hidalgo and Valley View school districts, all of those 5 school districts now have multiple high schools.
Right.
So we've now grown up to the point that we've learned that the guy at the other high school we play on Friday night isn't the enemy. Because it's not the kids from McAllen playing the kids from far on Friday night. It's the kids from my neighborhood, which oddly enough, my daughter has to drive past Memorial to go to high school at McAllen where she's zoned. But talk about blurred lines and confused lines. But, you know, we're all one community, and we've got 3 high schools, and we can compete, and we can still be friends.
Right.
And I think part of this maturation process of our region and the urbanization of our region has been critical to break down that Friday night football mentality, because now the district isn't, you know, the Brownsville, you know, when I was growing up, we in Los Fresnos, we were a 4A school. We competed all the way to Roma in our district. And I remember the first time we went in junior high, playing junior high basketball and played the kids in Ed Chelsea, and my mom kind of freaked out. She was worried about us. But now, you know, you have to get to the regional level before you have to cross the county line.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, isn't it more apt to say, I may very well have a business in one town, I bought my car in another town, I go to school in this particular district.
Yeah, you gotta go to San Juan to buy a Mercedes. Who would have ever thought of that?
Right. I mean, you know, so what about this other side? Right now we have, you know, 20-some mayors, 20-some city commissioners, 20-some police chiefs, 20-some fire chiefs and dog catchers, and I mean, from you're a business guy. I mean, what happens is there an efficiency in merging at times?
At times, you know, there's no guarantees. I mean, if you talk to corporate folks, there's been a lot of mergers that were completely premised on cost savings, and usually the ones that are just premised on cost savings don't end up working out all that great.
Okay.
Now, it's not to say that there aren't a lot of cost savings from some mergers, but that's one of, if that's the whole reason for doing this, we need to have a different conversation.
Right.
But I think in our case, yes, there would be some cost savings. There would certainly be some reallocations. There would be some better definition. There would be cost savings and efficiencies in the private sector, just because for you to build those 4 restaurants we were talking about, you could go to one planning department and have one meeting and get your approval to build the 4 buildings.
Right.
You know, the folks at STC could go to one meeting with one school administration and design a early college, high school, or a dual credit program for 122,000 students instead of 20,000 and 14,000 and 6,000.
Right.
So I think inherently there are some savings that will happen. But with the size, you also get some additional layers of bureaucracy that eat up some of the savings.
Well, let's go back to New York. I mean, there's that thing of, you know, I want to do this, but I don't want to lose my identity. And to this day, that exists.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the beauties of looking at New York as the
The
model
borough system.
of the borough system is, you know, if we could create a greater FEM, and this comes out of the fact that Sam and I had an argument about whether and I think this, I mean, it's kind of the elephant in the room here. Well, one of the questions that Sam, and the reason he came up with the Rio South Texas name, was Sam believes that you can't call this merged thing McAllen. I think I have a little bit of a different opinion on it, but I think it's a question that has to be addressed as part of the conversation.
We'll get your questions here in a minute.
So, yeah,
We're
almost.
Let's see, let's go to the next slide then. Let's see where we're at here. Okay, good, all right.
So that's basically
It's more of the same.
more of the same thing. The colored areas are the actual city limits, and the gray crosshatched areas are that unincorporated but urbanized area. So there's a big part up between the Delta area and Donna and Weslaco that has urbanized characteristics according to the population concentrations in the census. They're urbanized, but they're not incorporated in the city. And then likewise, kind of going out west. So that's basically it. This map, by the way, to give credit, is from the Hidalgo County MPO, and the red line is basically the metropolitan transit area that they're planning for. So we'll go to the next one. So
I think this sort of brings us full circle.
this brings us full circle. If you haven't guessed yet, that's the valley at night.
That's a satellite, you know, from space
Yeah.
image.
Yeah. No, actually, Sam took that out the window of the Chase Tower with a
With a and it just goes to say again, I mean, you can kind of tell where the river is, and you know, but north of the river, I mean, it's all one region. It really is. I mean, the lines that, you know, were drawn nearly 300 years ago that to this day still affect us. I mean, those aren't even our borders.
Right.
You know, and I think that's the big
that was one of the things that I kept, you know, coming back to, and, you know, when we're talking about the Friday night football mentality or whatever. These north-south lines that divide us,
they're not even our lines.
they're not even our lines. They were drawn by the Spanish monarch 250 years ago. Not that there's anything wrong with the Spanish monarchy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking the Spanish monarchy. They made very important economic development and political jurisdiction decisions for 1767. But that doesn't mean we have to continue to follow those lines 250 years later if they don't work.
Right. There's no inherent farness or Edinburgh-ness that those lines, you know, are preserving. So
Right.
to speak. You know, and the conversation that we as Futura McAllen and emerging leaders have had is sometimes it becomes this talk that we have over and over of how does McAllen protect its market share? How does McAllen protect its golden goose, which is the retail, and how do we, you know, sort of fend off FAR, which is on the rise, and Edinburgh is, you know, creeping on the come up, and how do we?
Yeah.
But is that really is that the short-sighted argument?
Exactly. I think that's the key point. You know, if you look at cities that don't have the unique geographic consequences that created these vertical columns, you know, the natural process of urban sprawl happens, and as the city kind of grows out from downtown, new developments come on and new retail comes on, and that suburbanization can many times be the financial catalyst to fund a reurbanization of the downtown.
But we never had a big enough urbanization.
Well, again, because of these lines,
Right.
our suburbanization, our urban sprawl, fell across an artificial line into another jurisdiction.
Right.
So McAllen, and you know, I say this in all honesty, I think McAllen is at a transition point. I'm a South McAllen guy, as I alluded to, you know, I heard during the last commission race, in the District 1 race, you know, there were some concerns about property values growing too fast. I wish mine would grow, period. You know, we have some, I think, significant stagnation in property values in the central part of town. And except for this northwest corridor and the Tres Lagos development now, the sprawl is not creating any funds for the coffers of McAllen.
Right.
And so we have to figure out, if we don't figure out how to do something about the lines,
Right.
then we've got to figure out something creative. You know, I guess, you know, this is maybe one of the points where the saying goes, you know, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it. The good news is, for those who study history, you're unleashed to make a whole new set of mistakes. So, you know, if we study history and we look at New York and we say, okay, there's a model that we could follow and we have this dialogue and it happens, then great. If we don't follow that model, then we'll find something. We've got a whole new set of mistakes we're going to have to make,
Right.
in order to figure out what to do about McAllen. Because, you know, McAllen can be Manhattan,
Right.
which would be kind of cool.
Right. All right, dude, we've talked about these.
Or
questions.
McAllen could be Detroit,
Now,
which
let's
wouldn't be too
Let's
cool.
open it up to Q&A.
Okay, we had a question right here, so.
Hi,
Yep.
this is Miguel Garcia. I'm Miguel Garcia. I'm actually currently working for the 30B, and I heard what you say, that joining regions, it happened to me. I was wrong. Now I'm a vaquero. Now I'm like, hi, like a wild horse. Now I'm a vaquero. Okay, but that's not the point. My question that was, when I first heard you, I was like, okay, we're gonna have the same population as San Antonio region if we join the entire valley from Zapata all the way to South Padre Island. But the area that we're covering, what's gonna happen with that? What's gonna happen with the housing benefits that students we abuse from in Edinburgh in comparison with the people that live in McAllen? Why the expenses, or even something more simple as in a benefit that is being installed in McAllen, let's say a internet connection, is that gonna be now have to be all the way from Zapata to South Padre Island?
Well, I think conceptual, there's two ways to, when you discuss something, there's discussing it at conceptual level first. Just to sort of throw out the 99% sure it's an impractical idea, but just to get the conversation started. So, is a super metro area that spans from...
Not a super metro, but a super municipality.
A super municipality from the shores of Brownsville to the shores of Falcon Lake gonna arise? Likely not.
Look, likely not, but there's, if anybody's read any business books by Jim Collins, Look Good to Great, he talks about businesses having a big, hairy, audacious goal. So that's kind of, I think, what the I-2 corridor or the Rio South Texas concept is. I mean, I think that's kind of a big, hairy, audacious goal that we can throw out there and say, hey, let's work toward that, one border at a time or a handful of borders at a time.
But the real answer to your question is, not to be a politician about it, is I don't know. I actually, nobody can know what the specifics are going to be.
Yeah.
The point at this point is to just start having that conversation.
And I think the second part of that is to have a conversation with our legislators, and I wish Senator Hinojosa or Representative Garrett could have been here tonight, but to create this legislative framework that we can have the possibility of doing this in an orderly and organized fashion. Because here's the reality. Even if we use the current mechanism and we have this vote and we vote next March to consolidate Edinburgh and McAllen, that doesn't consolidate the water system. That doesn't consolidate the sewer system. That doesn't consolidate the fire department. There's still a whole set of processes that have to happen, and it's in that process that will answer the questions of how the services get reallocated and redistributed. But it's all part of the dialogue that we are at least suggesting needs to happen.
So one of the things that I've heard is, a comparison of the Valley to New York City. The one thing I haven't heard is the development of communities. I haven't heard the word community used one time tonight. It's a big concern to me because I left Boston that has essentially the model that you guys are probably more practically going to have to adapt is this growth of small towns that like Roxbury and Jamaica Plain, East Boston, Charlestown. They've all consolidated, and what we have is a giant school system out of control. I lived in Jamaica Plain and had to enter a lotto system just to be able to go to the school closest to me, and that wasn't a guarantee my daughter would go to public school in my neighborhood, which meant that we would probably either have to drive or take a bus to her school, public school. I don't understand where the kind of lack of, oh, nobody cares if they're from Edinburgh. There is an identity that people cling to as part of being from the Valley, and it's generational. And if we're willing to make that kind of outgrowth that we're talking about, which I understand the value of it, then we need to be able to then, at the grassroots and underneath the surface, put some community initiatives in place. You talk about your property values not going up. Well, that's an opportunity for you to get with your neighbors and far and create community business initiatives. I think those are the things we're also not looking at. They're not mutually exclusive, but it's a huge concern to me when we hear about so much growth and we're not talking about the development of communities. And I think that's what's missing currently, but I think if we just let it get bigger, we're going to end up like New York City in the mid-90s, in the early 2000s, where there was potential, but it was still kind of not a town you wanted to go to. And I just wonder if we're not trying to bite off more than we can chew at this point and maybe just refocus on the infrastructure of what we currently have as towns so that we look more attractive to each other so that we can then decide from there. But all things being equal, if we're not willing to return to community schools so that people in the communities who pay taxes there will feel incentivized to send their children there, who will then feel incentivized to put their businesses there, and then how do we expect to then shift those attitudes? Because I take great pride of being from McAllen, and I love it when we play Edinburgh. And I love the McAllen Memorial rivalry. And Westlaco and Mercedes, never the two shall twain. And those are traditions, and that's the beautiful thing about here, but we're not talking about that. And I just wonder if that's a conversation that needs to happen.
There's two issues there, and the one word that jumped out to me is and maybe this is just what I'm into is the infrastructure question. And here's what I find. I oftentimes have to get city commission approval for things, so I've seen the way the different city commissions in our local communities work. And in Ghana right now, for example, they're trying to scratch together funds to get a new jail and municipal building put together, because what they have right now is a pretty meager Quonset hut. 2 miles down the road, the city of Alamo is fighting that same battle. And then 2 miles up the road, the next city is fighting the same battle. And all these smaller communities are trying to get their drainage handled or get their potholes filled. And so that fight is happening over and over and over again. If you could just get together and a little strength in numbers, you're able to solve a lot of those basic infrastructural problems. And then you can start talking about, you have to have your roads paved and the water draining before we can start talking about other quality of life issues. So I think that community enhancement.
We can't
infrastructure that we need the most is educating our kids and retaining a workforce and competitive wages, and as a general rule, having people making living wages. We don't have that now. How are we going to attract IKEA that pays their employees $15 an hour into a market where people are lucky to make $12, $13, $50 an hour? I make $15 an hour, no benefits. I have a college degree. I'm underemployed in this market because there's no venture capital or IT here. That's okay, those are my choices. What I'm saying is, when we can't even get on the same, employers to get on par with each other to elevate our working population we have now, how do we expect to stay competitive if we're worried about drainage a little bit more than education? I mean, we have to figure out how to balance them now before we grow more.
Well, I don't think it's entirely a question of education. I think education and economic development go hand in hand. And it's you know it's a chicken or the egg problem to some degree. You know, we can't recruit certain industries until we can show to those industries that we have a core workforce with core competencies that can fill those jobs. But at the same time, how do you convince people to undertake the study necessary to develop the core competency when you can't point to a job they will get when they have that competency? So you can't do one or the other, you have to do both. And when it comes to the economic development side, you have no idea how many lists we don't make because we are 132nd on the list. We are, the list starts with a city of 1 million people. We'll relocate to a place that, not a metro area of 1 million people, a city of 1 million people. And a, you know, an airport with direct flights to these locations. Well, in our metro area, and if you really look at our metro area, you have to include what over at MEDC they refer to as the south side of town, Reynosa and Matamoros. We are a metro area of 1.3 million people with 5 airports with commercial passenger service. There's no incentive for the airlines to look at direct service because they've got their fragmented little markets. You've got to, at some point, create scale to get bigger. Now, I appreciate the comments you had about community, and we may not have done a very good job of pointing to it. The idea behind the borough approach to a municipal consolidation was to create the ability to retain the community identities within a combined whole. And if we didn't communicate that clearly, I thank you for bringing that up, because that was our point. But unfortunately, you've got an architect and a lawyer / accountant, so we don't talk in those terms.
Okay, and I have another question here.
Okay.
Thank you so much. My name is George Atisa. I teach at UTRGV, and I thank my namesake George for inviting me. Came in a little late, and I felt I must be here because I feel I belong to the discussion so much that if there's anything I can say, that's good. Yes, my question is a follow-up. I want to ask a question differently. It's either it may not be a question, but the decisions that we make now will live beyond our generation towards the future generations. Some of them will be very good, and people will be, the future generation will be very happy that we made the right decisions. Some of them will be very bad, and it's not going to look good, and we may not even be able to undo them. So when we talk about the model of New York, for example, or Miami, or any other city, Washington, D.C., did they get everything right? So what I'm driving at is, when we make these decisions right now, we're talking about the valley, we have certain locational advantages that we need to take into account and begin to explore what is it that we have that is different from those other cities that we need to educate our people, so that even companies will begin to see this is a border town, first of all. We've got a port. There's certain locational advantages that we might be able to exploit by virtue of the fact that we're here in the valley and begin to put in place practices that are attractive, that livable environment, whereby a lot of the time when people are moving into a place, they take into consideration so many things: education, how is the health of the environment, what infrastructure are there, can I walk to place, do I have access to specific, very basic livelihood needs, and this draws onto the plans that we make. Do we have any specific plans that tell us this is the direction we're going? These are the practices that we need to put in place so that tomorrow, 5 years to come, the sort of things that people will see that is different in this place that are attractive.
I think you've hit on a key point.
And before you answer, I do want to point out that we have about 10 more minutes, so I think we're going to have to keep questions and answers short.
Not gonna happen.
I'll take that under advisement. The reason I can't use Twitter is because I can't limit any comment to 140 characters. The short answer of do we have those kind of plans is sort of, but not really. And I think part of the problem is this fragmentation of the region. I mean, let's talk very simply about one of the topics of the program I was at earlier, the Economic Development, Border Economic Development Symposium, was transportation. In our region, we have, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 international bridges from Roma to Brownsville. Those are owned by a county, 5 different municipalities, and 3 private owners. 2 private owners. Try just to get that group together and agree to a consensus plan about developing customs infrastructure at the bridge. We talk about air transportation. Try to get 5 airports in 2 countries to get together and talk about a unified plan to develop air travel. Try to get between school districts and cities just in the Hidalgo County, 27 police chiefs together to talk about, ask Ricky Rodriguez at the DA's office. They get files in 27 different formats that they have to put together and turn into prosecutions. I think,
It's the analogy of, rather than me cooking a big pot of pasta and being able to serve everybody because we're doing it all together, I have to cook 27 different meals, and you're gluten-free and you want a sandwich and he wants eggs, and it's just much more cumbersome. And that's the reality that we live in right now.
yeah. So while it would be beautiful to have those sort of plans, I think it comes back to what seems to happen as an observer of the process and a fringe participant in it. What seems to happen is we all get together and we agree in general about a plan, but then when we go to get to the details and we then have to break off. Let's look at recruiting an industry to the area. We could do all of the global planning of we're a metro area of 1.3 million, and there are 70,000 students enrolled in higher education in our region. That's a real number, by the way. 70,000 students enrolled in higher education in our region.
Okay, I have 2 more questions, and I think that's about all of the, that's a
Can I ask one?
If you will make your question as brief as possible, I'll try to get all 3 of them.
I just have a comment. I appreciate what you all are saying, and I'm from the Valley. I've been a developer and real estate broker here, commercial real estate broker. So I understand your pain about going to different cities and having to learn a new set of rules for each different city. But I think until we get a grip on what Hidalgo County as a government allows to happen outside the city limits, we're going to have a hard time improving the quality of life as a region. Because as each city continues to grow, we're going to have to eventually take over some of the shoddy development that's going on in the county and has been going on for years and years and continues to go on. I just think that until we make a collective effort to do something about what's being done outside of our city limits as a region, whether that's going together as Futuro Rio Grande Valley or Futuro Hidalgo County, I just think that that's step number one, and we are looked at pretty poorly, I think, from a national and state level in terms of what we're doing in the county, and I think that's something that as a group, maybe Futuro McAllen can go that direction.
And that's a great point. I know from
Why don't I get the other two comments and then you guys can kind of address
Chop it
all
up.
of them. And I might say that we're doing Futuro now,
Which is a sort of,
regional.
but that's another topic. Okay, two more, Pablo and,
There was another one up there before me, so.
well, we've only got 6 minutes, so make it short and snappy.
All right, so to lay back there, I absolutely agree with, obviously, I think this conversation wasn't geared so much towards education, but I do think that's obviously a imperative point of conversation that needs to be discussed at some future point. Referring to the communities portion, I think that we all are looking for that community association with one another, and I think it's creating those amenities and having that future vision and foresight that will create the amenities for the increasing quality of life, and I think that's what we're all trying to aspire to and bring those quality lives. Second, and then the last thing is I want to say is, to Blake's conversation, is what do you think it's going to need to change or put what do you think is going to need to change to put people in the right position to have this sort of dialogue or this sort of outside the box futuristic view so that we can come together and look at this overall goal for the betterment of our community?
we'll get to that in a second. Thanks, Pablo.
That obviously is the big question. You make it very short, please.
I'll try to make it as short as I can. One person can make a difference, I believe. And I think if this is a microcosm of what we have to look forward to in the city of McAllen in this area, I think it's great. But I disagree from the standpoint that we have to just look at one thing. We have to include everything, because everything that's been discussed in here today is not necessarily exclusive or mutually exclusive. We need to use all of these things. 30 some odd years ago, the city of McAllen sent me to Indianapolis, and at that time I came back with this same thing, this idea, and submitted the Pepper report that was the beginning of what they did in Indianapolis. I think we need to do that again. I've heard the same discussions at the Kennedy School, because when I went up there, the problem with New York is that you had one guy that was in charge, and he was not a real nice fellow that made things happen. And that's the only thing, in many cases, that drives business and it eventually creates the industry and what you need for these communities. And until we do that, I think one of the things, and the last thing to shut up, that is beneficial here is when I see these young people here. If this is what we have to look forward to, I think it's good because they have an interest and they're here. And they're players in the system, and I would like to hear from them to find out what they think this community should be in the future. Because from my perspective, this is not a bad area. I like it. In another lifetime, I had a little bit to do with the building of this community, and I'd like to keep it. And I think that it could be a McAllen or Finza or Simza. But I do think that I'm glad for you guys. Thank you. And thank you for giving me the time, because I've spent years and years and years going around all these things, and every time I go someplace, the first thing they do is somebody sticks a mic in my face after I've paid several $1,000s to fly someplace. and they say, well, I'm sorry, we only have a minute, so you have to cut it short. If you don't do anything, we need to sit and talk.
Well, and this is the point.
We need to have another session,
Well,
I think.
here's the point. This isn't to like say we need to have a pre-meeting to have another meeting.
Exactly.
But the answer to I think the different questions is really
Yes, no, maybe, sometimes.
maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah, why not? And our
How many
focus-
of you are
and our
interested in having a follow-up to this session, and I think we need to have more comment from you people out there. Are you guys up for another session later, maybe this
Dave
spring?
hates talking.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've talked out,
I'm very serious.
I-
Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I'd love to, and that was.
I'd like to see more comment from the audience, so you guys can't talk as long. And keep your questions shorter and your observations, and more people then, if you want a follow-up, Futuro?
And that was honestly the absolute best possible result that Sam and I could hope for. At least speaking for me, and I think I speak for Sam as well. The best possible result that we could hope for of tonight is that there's 6 more people in town besides us that want to keep talking about this. And we'll keep talking as long as anybody wants to talk about it. But next time we got to bring our friends from far in Edinburgh and Michigan.
Yes, because Futuro McAllen has officially, thanks to Olmo and some of the Code RGVers and others, we are moving and transitioning into what we're calling Futuro Now. Our quality of life issues do not stop at the city limits. They are very important to all of us, and we have to think out of the box, much bigger. And if you will come back and get your friends to come back, we will have a follow-up session sometime this spring. We'll figure it out. We do have a follow-up session that is going to be very exciting on, we just found it out today, February the 11th, and it is definitely looking at some of the things that you're talking about, and Monica is one of the ones who has really put it together. Can you tell us something quickly in about 90 seconds?
I don't know about 90 seconds, but I'll do my best.
Keep it to 60 so I can have 30 to answer this question.
February the 11th, the Texas Border Coalition will be in FAR having our regional meeting. For those of you who do not know what the Texas Border Coalition is, it's a regional...
Does anybody know what it is? Somebody of you do know. Good.
A regional organization that is made up of municipalities, of businesses, of counties. And we work on issues that are regional. Transportation, in fact, it was actually founded by McAllen, city leaders of our area that realized that when we were constantly being looked over in Austin and Washington on transportation needs, it was definitely a need to bring everybody together and fight for something for the region. Well, that organization has now led, and it goes from Brownsville to El Paso, and it covers many of the things that we're talking about here today. Covers areas of transportation, education, health. A new committee is economic development, immigration, border security, all of the issues that pertain to the region and the area. Much of our mottos are definitely dealing with, let's deal with the stuff we agree on. Let's not focus on the stuff we disagree on, and let's just move on, because if not, we cannot achieve what we need to achieve. When you go, as you all have explained, in Austin and Washington, they do not want to hear from the region as each independent city. They cannot get things done in Washington and Austin with that type mindset. They can get things done when the region is in agreement. And that alone is, as you all talk about, I mean, the committee that I chair deals with exactly what you're talking about. Those bridges, immigration, some of the stuff, if any of you all have looked at the committees that we're looking at in Austin right now, you're talking about sanctuary cities. You're talking about heavy political items that have an overall effect on funding that and have repercussions by certain stands that you take. So it's a very exciting meeting that will be here in McAllen on February the 11th.
And we may have some co-sponsors to that. I hope all of you will come. Put it on your calendar. And you have said you want a follow-up to this. David and Sam, are you on?
Yeah, I mean, I think our emails are available. And
Okay.
stuff, that we can make those available, so if anybody wants to contact us.
Check the Facebook page, Futuro McAllen Facebook page. Olmo, you've we've got our transportation, which was fabulous last month, and our IT initiative that we're going to get all of our kids hooked up. That was good. So it'll be on our Facebook page. Thank you, Olmo. And this will be on our Facebook page. We will have this February the 11th, and then sometime this spring, we will have a follow-up to this. But try to get more people out. We need more people talking about this, and
It's
really getting it.
It's got to be those of you, there's a few of you emerging leaders guys who may not remember this, but the folks like Sam and I that are getting a little thin on the top and further back. Remember back in the 80s that shampoo commercial, you know, where you know somebody had the shampoo and they told their friends and they told two friends and they told two friends. And
That's what you got to do.
That's what we've got to do. We've got to expand the other. I do want to real quickly kind of consolidate an answer to all three of you.
I haven't seen you do anything very quickly yet, David.
Okay. But it's important I throw those words in to give the perception that I might be. One of the answers, you're right in terms of the county issue, and I've been out of the seat, but I used to work as the attorneys for the county, so I know a lot about county development regulation, at least up to about 15 years ago, at which point I stopped doing it because they were making me crazy. But one of the answers to that actually is municipal ETJ controls are capped based on population. So McAllen is the only city in Hidalgo County that has a 5-mile ETJ because it's the only city that has over 100,000 population. So by creating FIM, we would instantly be able to extend the ETJ of FIM out 5 miles from the boundaries. So a lot of these areas, a lot of those gray areas in that map, which are those areas you're talking about, would now be in an ETJ, and the city rather than the county would be able to address some of that. So this actually, doing this does tackle part of that problem. As far as kind of the rest of it, and also going along to your comments, you know, where all of this lies for me is something about moving us forward. I heard today at the BDC event, they were looking at the education question as a big piece of that. You know, we've got 70,000 students enrolled in higher education in South Texas, but the percentage of our population that has a college degree is exactly the same as it was in 1994. We haven't moved the needle. Now, are you a pessimist or an optimist? You want the good news? Our population has doubled, and we have kept up. We haven't lost ground. We haven't gained ground either. In order to do the things, from my perspective, and my thing, in order for us to do the things that allow us to gain ground, we have to have a bigger and more diverse private sector economy in this region. To quote Ronald Reagan, the best social program is a good job. And in order to get those jobs, we have to be able to be a player on a state and national and international scale. And believe me, it is difficult to be a player when you represent a city of 140,000 population, even though you're from a binational metropolitan region, which may soon actually exist through some work from Congressman Vela. They're creating a new statistical region that's a binational region where we could go. We could say we're 3 million population, but we still have to have anchors. We have to have a couple of core organizations that can take the lead. And the last piece of this is, and it's something that I've learned from the last 2 or 3 years of working closely with MDC, and that is, and I don't think we don't have any elected officials in here tonight, I don't think, but I would say this whether they're here or not. The reality is, no matter how great a person is that we elect to office, once they take that oath of office and they assume that role, they have two horizons: the next budget cycle and the next election cycle. So we, no, depending on which comes first. But, you know, the question of sales tax revenue, we didn't even get into, you know, the economic development of locating a manufacturing facility. The reality is, it doesn't matter whether it locates in FAR or McAllen. It makes not a hill of beans to the budget, where it locates. It's the jobs it creates that count. But
You're summarizing this by saying what?
By saying what? In 15 seconds is, we can't count on our political leadership to do the long-term strategic thinking for our community. We have to do it as citizens, as business leaders, as people in the community. We have to tell them what we want them to do.
And this is hopefully the beginning of that conversation. Thank you for